The ultimate prize after a lifetime in politics.
George, for Joe Biden, this is the end of a 30-year quest for the presidency. And as you say, not long ago, this was a race that was essentially written off. But Joe Biden fought back, running consistently on a message that this campaign, this election, was a battle for the soul of this country. We have seen him launch his campaign with the words Charlottesville, Virginia, arguing that it was the president's response to seeing white supremacists march through the streets of that city that inspired him to run. And for the last 562 days, Joe Biden has argued that this race is a judgment call on President Trump's administration and, of course, a referendum on his handling of this pandemic. George, I have to tell you, it is very fitting that it was Pennsylvania that put him over the top. It is a sentimental win for Joe Biden. It is his home state. It is where his values were formed. His political life was born. It is where he formed that Scranton versus Park Avenue worldview that was at the core, really, of this race. And now Joe Biden says that with this win, he will have a mandate to try and bring this country together. George, it is going to be a Herculean task. And one more point. Regardless of politics today, this is a massive moment of historic significance in this country. We have had 48 vice presidents, George, 48 white men. And today, with Kamala Harris now set to become the next vice president, it means that women across this country, young girls, young black and brown girls, Indian Americans, will for the first time be able to look at the White House and see themselves reflected in the People's House.
Dramatic breakthrough right there. John Carr, you've covered Donald Trump. This marks the end of what may be America's most uncommon presidency.
George, this is the beginning of the end of a presidency unlike any that we have ever seen. Donald Trump was the first person elected president who had never served a day in government, not a day in the military. And he saw the presidency as the world's greatest reality TV show. He was the executive producer, the chief promoter, and the star of The Trump Show. He captivated the world's attention unlike any political figure that we have ever seen, at least in our lifetimes. Paraphrasing something John Lennon once said about the Beatles, he started saying in recent days on the campaign trail that he is the most famous person in the world besides Jesus Christ. And he became not just the most famous person, but simultaneously the most loved and the most loathed. He upended Washington. He transformed the Republican Party. He disregarded political norms. From his love letters to Kim Jong-un to the brutal photo op at St. John's Church with the protesters cleared out with tear gas. To his dramatic return from Walter Reed Hospital just last month, he had an instinct for the dramatic gesture, and as he saw it, the more outrageous and divisive, the better. And George, just a reminder here, this race this presidency is not over. Donald Trump has not conceded, and regardless, there are 74 days until Joe Biden's inauguration. So we have not seen the finale of The Trump Show, and I am sure that he has some ideas on that.
No question about that. David Muir, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, both white men in their 70s. They both like golf. The similarities pretty much end there.
They do. This whole campaign has really been a study in contrast, George, as you know. And these two men are so different. We know Joe Biden, in fact, will turn 78 in the next couple of weeks. He'll be the oldest to be elected president here in the United States. Until this point, President Trump had been the oldest at 70 at his inauguration. But these differences are deep. As Mary Bruce just pointed out, this campaign began and ended in Pennsylvania. Joe Biden reminding this country of his Scranton roots, where he was born as a boy, where his father struggled to find work, Joe Sr., where the family was forced to move in with his grandparents, with his mother's parents for a time before they moved to Wilmington. And there was one anecdote that Joe Biden shared through the years that landed in particular with this outreach to the working class, the middle class, his messaging in this campaign and in all the campaigns prior. You know, his father worked as a manager for an auto dealership where they used to hand out silver coins as your bonus for good work. And he tells the story of one Christmas when all the workers had gathered there for the holiday party, where the owner of the dealership threw the silver coins on the floor and just watched his employees scramble to get a hold of these silver coins. And it was in that moment, he said, his father got his wife and walked out and said, this is about the dignity of workers and the dignity of work. We know that President Trump followed in his father's footsteps into the real estate empire that his father built, was given what President Trump said was $1 million head start, a gift from his father. Many have said it actually equated to millions of dollars. No rap on that, but that's just very different from Joe Biden's start. And Joe Biden made that appeal. And it's very interesting when we point out, as Mary mentioned, he first ran for president in the late 80s. This was his third time. This is a man who's carefully waited, did not plan on running, thought that this moment demanded that he run with what he saw in Charlottesville and thereafter. And perhaps at 78 years old, we mentioned that he's an old white man here in America, and I know the Democratic Party was very happy with all of the candidates they saw on that stage, the future perhaps of the Democratic Party. But Joe Biden perhaps uniquely qualified for this moment to find a leader who might be able to unite this country in such a polarized time. And we've seen that with what he's been able to bring back into the Democratic fold, at least in this election, white working class, people all over the country, the blue wall reinforced in the South in Georgia, in the West in Arizona and Nevada. A very unique moment in history, given what this country's going through.
Says he wants to be a president for all Americans. Lindsay Davis, what a moment that will be when Kamala Harris takes the oath as Vice President of the United States.
What a moment indeed. And I'm thinking about the future of it and the history of it at the same time. Of course, this year we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, giving some women in this country the right to vote. But think about it like this. In 1964, when Kamala Harris was born, black women in this country still couldn't vote. And so the magnitude of this moment certainly is not lost on black women and likely many women in general. The idea of this dream deferred for far too long for the likes of Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman to run for president in 1972. And the countless and nameless others who dared to not even dream of it because they didn't think that it could happen. And so I'm especially thinking about the little girls of all colors, but in particular black and brown girls, because there's so much power, George, in seeing someone who looks like you, being able to watch Kamala Harris achieve and excel and crack that second highest glass ceiling. And if they're able to harness all of the possibility of that trajectory for themselves.
Rachel Scott, thank you, Lindsay. Rachel Scott, you saw that energy out on the campaign trail with Kamala Harris.
I did, George, and she would often talk about how her story was the American story. She is the daughter of Jamaican and Indian immigrants, and she often would say that she would see herself in so many of the little girls out there that were coming out to watch her deliver her remarks. Her mother would always tell her that she may be the first to do a lot of things, but that she needs to make sure that she is not the last. And I could tell you, George, that as we have waited for these results to come in, I have seen little girls come here along the perimeter, stand by these fences and try and peek through and trying to get a sense, trying to get a scene of Senator Kamala Harris. It is those little girls and women of color all across this nation who have felt counted out, who have felt like they have not been represented in politics, who have been told to just stand by and wait their turn, that will now feel like they have a seat at the table. And that is what makes this moment so much larger than politics, George.
Rachel Scott, thanks very much. Mary Bruce, we have the first reaction from the Biden campaign.
We do, George. It is not from the president-elect yet. It is from one of his top advisors saying character, justice, and decency were on the ballot. Character, justice, and decency won. I have to tell you, as we have sat here for the last 4 days watching carefully, poring over all of these results, there has been just this growing excitement, enthusiasm within the Biden campaign. The waiting game, I think, has been very difficult for many of them, of course, as this whole country has been really on edge for much of this. And now I can tell you with confidence there is a lot of celebrating, a lot of relief, and a concept that there is a lot of hard work to come from the Biden campaign.
Mary Bruce, thanks very much. Cecilia Vega, perhaps it's fitting, given the last 4 years as this announcement is being made, we have new tweets from President Trump as he heads to the golf course.
He's at the golf course, George. That is where the president is as this news is coming in about the seeming fate of his reelection. And you mentioned those tweets. He's tweeted a number of times today. Nearly all of these tweets that we have heard from the president so far have been slapped with these misleading labels from Twitter, because he is continuing to carry on with this conspiracy theory that this election is being stolen from him. George, this was a referendum on President Trump, what we are seeing here today. He came in as an outsider with no track record, and in part that is how he won this White House. People wanted someone from the outside, particularly someone who was running against a consummate insider like Hillary Clinton. But this time around, he had a track record that he had to campaign on, and that is not what sold America on a re-election campaign. You know, for so many people, they felt like he ran the last 4 years based on some of the ugliest parts of our country, on racism, frankly, and lies and mistruths. While for others, he spoke to what many believe is a forgotten America, and they found someone in him who was finally speaking their language. But he needed this race to be about anything other than him. And yet, time and time again, what we saw from this president in terms of an undisciplined campaign style was that he could not shake that. This was not a race about anything other than Donald Trump. He always turned it into himself. And now here we are, as this news is coming down, with 140,000 record cases in the coronavirus again yesterday alone. A new outbreak inside the White House, his chief of staff contracting it, a number of other campaign officials and White House aides contracting it. And the irony of that, George, that as America voted a referendum on his handling of the coronavirus, so much of America, the majority of America, not happy with the way he handled it, we're now looking at yet another outbreak at the White House again today.
That's right. 7 cases at the White House right now. I have Chris Christie on the phone. And Chris, picking up on Cecilia's point right there, you had said throughout this campaign that Donald Trump has to make it a choice election, not a referendum election. He never succeeded in doing that.
Well, George, I don't think until the very end, excuse me, I don't think until the very end he really tried. I think in the last 10 days or so, when he was running around the country in his rallies, he really started to show the contrast. He started to show the videos of Vice President Biden on energy and on other issues. And I really think that's when he began to get traction, when people started to think, all right, well, this is a choice. It's not just about Donald Trump. But I think it obviously was too late. You know, I've been talking about this since the summer, that the only way for him to win this election was to make it a choice between he and Vice President Biden, not a referendum on himself, especially in the midst of a global pandemic and an economic recession that was the result of the pandemic, and racial strife across the country. And when he didn't do that, when he chose to run the same campaign in 16 that he ran in 20, he made it much more difficult on himself. Still amazingly made it as close as he did, given what the projections were beforehand. But in the end, a referendum election for an incumbent during difficult times is not what you want to have on your hands.
Chris Christie, you're a graduate of the University of Delaware. You've known Joe Biden a long time, I think more than 30 years. What kind of a president do you think he'll be?
You know, it's really hard to tell, George. I can tell you this. The man that he's portrayed himself as during this campaign, compassionate and caring and a good heart, is certainly the guy that Mary Pat and I have known over the last 35 years. He is a good person, a good man who really does care about doing the right thing and caring about people. As I've said, though, in terms of what kind of president he's going to be, he has a fundamental decision to make now. And that is, does he want to unite the country or try to unite the Democratic Party? I don't think he can do both, George. And so he's going to have to decide, is he going to be a centrist president who will attempt to work with Republicans and try to get things done? Or will he play to the more extreme Sanders, AOC, Elizabeth Warren wing of the party, which will divide this country even more perhaps than it is divided now, because it'll be on issues that people deeply care about. And so it's going to be up to him. Does he have the capacity to do it? He sure does. The question is, will he have the strength to do it?
Chris Christie, thanks very much. Yvette Simpson, hard to imagine that someone who spent 47 years in Washington is actually the candidate of change, but when you look at the ticket as a whole, that is true.
I think that's right. I mean, first of all, we have to remember what we're escaping. I want to use the word escaping today, what we're transitioning from. And I think having Joe Biden be the person, I think today, who we're talking about, when you just think about tone and tenor, is a big deal. I also think that there are a lot of people who are excited about the future. And so Kamala Harris represents that. I think she's someone that we feel like we can work with and talk to. I think she can be a unifier. I think she's strong. I think she's powerful, and I think we need that. And so at the end of the day, I think the combination of the ticket is exactly what we need right now. It's the best we could have expected, I think, today, and we're hopeful. But at the end of the day, I do want to respond to what Governor Christie said. When you look at this map, Democrats showed up, Black and brown people showed up, progressives showed up. And what I hope that the Biden-Harris presidency does is not ignore those people. because once you lose those people, you can't get them back. They showed up through a pandemic, and they want real change, and they want it now. Don't miss those cries. The Republicans don't get to decide who Democrats are or who this president is. They showed up for their person. And Republicans, time and time again, they get into leadership and then they only serve their people first. They don't come to Democrats and say, let's be bipartisan. They serve their folks first. But as soon as Democrats get into leadership, Republicans are like, we need to work together. You need to not talk to the people or work for the people who got you to the party. And my hope is we will have a lot of conversations going forward about how we actually serve Americans in this country.
The reality is that Donald Trump's voters came out as well. Republican voters came out as well. Donald Trump will win the second highest vote total of any American candidate, presidential candidate in American history. Sarah Fagan, Republicans, right now, we're not sure whether they're going to maintain control of the Senate. We have those 2 seats out in Georgia, but they had a decent night. They picked up seats in the House as well. This is going to create a challenge for Vice President Biden, but also a challenge for the Republican Party.
Well, sure it is. You know, the question is, where does the party go from here? And, you know, we're still the minority party with the president, or will be the minority party with the president in office. And, you know, I look at this election, and what is so striking to me is we saw something Tuesday that almost never happens in American politics. And if there's any question about this country being a center-right country, in my mind, it still is. Republicans had a good night. They actually had a great night. They picked up a governor. They picked up the House seats you mentioned. Likely will retain control of the Senate. We do have runoffs. This was a repudiation of Donald Trump as a person, not his policies. His policies on the ballot did very well. He underperformed these congressional candidates in many congressional districts. That rarely happens in American politics. And so when you step back and look at this, Donald Trump only has himself to blame.
Sarah Fagan, thanks very much. Terry Moran, I imagine there are going to be endless debates whether this is a center-right or a center-left country. One thing we can say for sure, it is a divided country. As you look at state after state after state, 50 to 49, 49 to 49, 49 to 48.
It is a divided country. One wonders if there is some kind of consensus in the middle, and Joe Biden's going to go look for it, because while Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016 by saying, "Make America great again," harking back to an American yesteryear, in this race, in many ways, it was really Joe Biden who was the throwback candidate, right? He's an old-fashioned, hand-shaking, backslapping Paul who looks at those divides and says, I've made deals all my life. I made deals with Bob Dole. I made deals with Strom Thurmond. Maybe I can do something here. And he doesn't tweet. Donald Trump, for all of his Make America Great Again, is a 21st century figure. He is a master of social media. He was one of the most powerful figures on the newest media in the world.
You know, but let me just stop you. You say master of social media, and that is certainly true. He saw that as his major communication device. It may have been his undoing.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm saying. The country looked at the guy who was the reality TV star, the social media guy who wanted to reinvent the staid grand old party into a 21st century nationalist populist movement, and they wanted to go with something a little safer, a little quieter, maybe even a throwback to a different kind of ideal of manhood. The strong, silent, decent type rather than the braggart.
Cecilia Vega, we have a statement from the Trump White House.
Yeah, we do, George. I'm just, bear with me here because we just got it and I'm reading through it. It's full of some falsehoods, as you might imagine. But what they say at the gist is, we know, quote, we know why Joe Biden is rushing to falsely pose as the winner and why his media allies are trying so hard to help him. They don't want the truth to be exposed. The simple fact is the election is far from over. They say Joe Biden has not been certified as the winner of any states, let alone in any highly contested states. And they go on to lay out their claim, particularly in Pennsylvania. They say that their legal observers were not permitted meaningful access to watch the counting process. And just a very quick fact check there were Trump team observers allowing canvassing process within 6 feet. They wanted to be closer. They said they couldn't see some of the ballots being counted. They go on to say, to foreshadow what's coming, beginning Monday, our campaign will start prosecuting our case in court to ensure election laws are fully upheld and the rightful winner is seated. The American people are entitled to an honest election. So they go on to basically say that the court fight goes on, and that is what we know has been happening behind the scenes. The legal team has been gearing up for this, that the Trump team has appointed a conservative activist, longtime conservative activist, David Bossie, to run this legal team going forward. You know, I just keep going back to what we heard the president say in recent weeks in the lead up to this election, George, which is that he doesn't like to lose. He had been complaining for weeks. He had come back as far as 2016 campaign, complained that the election would be rigged, and he sort of speculated what would it mean if he lost against someone like Joe Biden. He couldn't even fathom the possibility of losing to someone like Joe Biden. But I'll remind you, in our reporting, those around him, Republicans that I talked to in Washington in the lead up to this election, had tried so hard to get him to focus in this campaign, to do anything other than to focus on these dark and ugly law and order themes that really were not winning him over. These ugly things he was saying about housing going up in the suburbs, and that was not the winning strategy, and people saw it coming, to focus on how he could bring the economy back in the wake of the coronavirus. But time and time again, he went to that base, he went to that gut. And it seems that this is not the winning ticket for him this time.
Cecilia Vega, thanks. Tom Yamas, you wanted to follow on that statement?
Yeah, I covered the president's campaign, and what I learned 4 years ago was the extreme reach President Trump has. He even had it when he was a candidate. And we're talking about unifying the country, and Joe Biden has a tough job ahead of him. But I think part of that, of unifying the country, has a lot to do with President Trump. And until he comes out and says Joe Biden is the winner of this election, it's going to be very, very hard, because his movement is post-Fox News. Fox News just called Joe Biden the next president. His movement is post-Fox News. It is directly from President Trump's mouth. So until the president can come out and say, listen, America, I lost this election fair and square, it's time to move on, it's going to be very difficult for that one part. It's also going to hurt the Republican Party, because every candidate on the Republican ticket that runs is going to be asked by reporters, did Joe Biden fair and square win this election? And they're going to have to answer that question, and the MAGA crowd is going to be listening.
And I want to take that to Martha Raddatz, because Martha, you spent a lot of time out in the country talking to members of the MAGA movement, and I guess one of the big questions, does that movement survive a loss?
Well, I think they survive in some ways. We don't know how exactly they'll survive, but just to Tom's point right now, I'm actually getting texts from some of those MAGA supporters saying, look, this isn't certified. The media has no right to do it. So exactly right. Until they hear from Donald Trump, they're just not going to accept it. That's just a couple of people, though, there, George, because others have said they are looking at Joe Biden as a leader. They are deeply disappointed that Donald Trump didn't win, but they see a softness in Joe Biden, a leadership softness. There is no starker difference that I can remember between an outgoing president and an incoming president. And that boils down to what you said at the very beginning, that kind of simple decency. And that is a huge change, no matter what your policies are. That's what people will look for. The transition, frankly, could be pretty simple. Joe Biden has been in that White House before. Many of the people he will bring into that White House have been there before. But it will be a matter of character and kind of calming the country down. And I frankly think that is Joe Biden's first up. You can talk about the politics, you can talk about the infighting in the Democratic Party, and boy, that's going to be there. But if the Republican Senate remains, Joe Biden has to work with them. He has to reach out. And those MAGA supporters will see that. What Joe Biden has to do is convince everyone that America is already great.
And maybe to take a breath and not pay all that much attention to politics for a little while.
Exactly.
David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker, let me bring you in on this. Donald Trump was elected by a divided America 4 years ago. He's now been defeated by a divided America right now. And perhaps it's appropriate that he's going out as he came in. That initial statement in response to Joe Biden being projected as the winner, a litany of lies.
Well, I think Martha's right that the crazy has to stop, that America has to take a deep breath. It has to feel some sense of relief, and that a man of truly bad character is now gone. But presidential races also mean something about the way we live our lives and about our futures and our children's future. And the transition from Trump to Joe Biden has to mean something for the environment. It has to mean something about the strength and durability of democratic processes. It has to mean something about radical income inequality and the racial, the racism that we've talked so much about all summer, and that we should be talking about all our lives. So Joe Biden has before him, I hope, a moment to take a breath, And I hope that he will instill some sense of decency and calm in the country, which so sorely needs it. But at the same time, we just face gigantic issues of public health and the environment and so much else. His task before him, particularly without a majority in the Senate, is going to be vast, and it's going to demand everything of him and everything of us as citizens as well.
No question about that. David Remnick, thanks. Mary Bruce, we have a new statement now from former Vice President Biden.
George, we now have the first reaction from the president-elect. I'm going to go ahead and read this statement in full. Joe Biden saying, "I am honored and humbled by the trust the American people have placed in me and in Vice President-elect Harris. In the face of unprecedented obstacles, a record number of Americans voted, proving once again that democracy beats deep in the heart of America." He goes on to say, with the campaign over, it's time to put the anger and the harsh rhetoric behind us and come together as a nation. It's time for America to unite and to heal. He concludes by saying, "We are the United States of America, and there's nothing we can't do if we do it together."
Mary Bruce,
It
thanks
is
for
a statement.
Thanks very much. I want to bring that to Rahm Emanuel. Rahm, you said last night that should be the lead message coming out of the president-elect. It's time to heal. It's time to bring the country together. Again, you've also served in presidential transitions. You were appointed chief of staff to President Obama just days after his election. How does President-elect Biden approach these challenges right now?
Well, first, I think, showing respect both for the process and the people that didn't vote for him is the first step of healing. And I think Joe, the vice president and President-elect Biden, has the character that people don't get angry about. It doesn't elicit hatred. And that's the first step, number one. Number two, you have to immediately move on all fronts at every level. You got to get your team up on the virus and what it's going to do to, as he said, I'm going to arrest the virus, not the economy. Number three, he's got to move on and get the economic team and the White House staff operating. And that is get a whole team in place from the economic team to the domestic policy and propose a set of ideas quickly that gives a sense of energy, purpose, focus, and determination. And part of that White House, part of that economic team and coronavirus team and foreign policy team is then to bring in the leaders and put it on them that we wear the American jersey together, that you have a role to play in solving this problem and not continuing the campaign, but to actually turn the page and begin the next step. And he does that with a sense of purpose, direction, and vigor. I do think it's important that the calmness he called for was not just calmness and patience, but also it underscores the respect he has for all Americans. It was, as he said from day one, I'm going to be a president for all of America. And I think that is not. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think that is both a kind of a temperament as well as a message that he stays within that that's his wheelhouse. And it's true. I keep coming back to this. That is who Vice President Biden is. And the closer you are to the authenticity of not only your message, but your character, and those two line up, the stronger it's going to be for you.
Campaigns reveal who candidates are. The White House reveals who presidents are. I want to go to John Santucci, our White House producer, who's wired into the Trump world. It feels as if the president is going through the 7 stages of grief right now. How are those around him going to get him to acceptance?
Well, George, what I've been told is that they're going to give the president the weekend. They know he wanted to clear his head, and he's doing that right now. He's at his golf course just a few miles from the White House. But what I'm told is let him get through the weekend, and then Monday there would be that come-to-Jesus conversation, if you would, with the president, that this is not going his way. And what aides have told me, really, is that, very slowly over the last few days, there has been that realization within the West Wing, within the president's family and campaign, that this was not going to be a second term for Donald Trump. And the turning point there, George, was when the numbers started to tighten in Georgia. Now, obviously, we haven't called that race, but it is certainly not looking good for the Trump team there. But, for this president, George, I mean, this is something that he really felt in the last couple days. And Chris Christie made this point. Donald Trump started to act more like he was ready for a second term in the last 10 days. I think it had a lot to do with Donald Trump being back on the campaign trail. He's dismissed the polls as something that he ignored doors, doesn't believe in them, but the crowds, he does. He felt it. I mean, aides I were talking to on the road said, we felt the enthusiasm. We really believed we were going to be back for another round, and obviously now that's not going their way, George.
John Santucci, thanks. What you're seeing right there are crowds gathering in front of St. John's Church in Lafayette Square. Of course, that was site of the moment where President Trump went across that street as protesters were out there for the Black Lives Matters movement, brandish a Bible surrounded by military leaders and members of his cabinet, including the Attorney General, William Barr. Pierre Thomas, racial issues bubbled beneath the surface all through the presidency, bubbled up above the surface at Charlottesville and in so many protests across the country this summer. It will be Joe Biden's job to heal those divisions as well.
You're absolutely right, George. I'm sitting here thinking as this race gets called that Joe Biden put together one of the most diverse voting blocks that the country's ever seen. He got more votes than any other presidential candidate in history, including Barack Obama. And I was thinking about George Floyd and how that horrific death seemed to galvanize people of all races, all demographics, all ages, to say there were certain things that needed to change. And Joe Biden, at least, you know, from the empathy standpoint, seemed to try to address both sides. Yes, we have to support law enforcement, but if you think that there's not systemic racism in law enforcement, then you're probably wrong. And the country seemed to agree with that. And the other thing, George, that strikes me about this announcement today is that clearly 68 million plus people, 69 million plus people voting for Donald Trump. There are a lot of good people who voted for Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, you had a lot of people, particularly people of color, notwithstanding whatever inroads President Trump made with African-American males and Hispanic males, who felt like that Donald Trump was poking them in the eye from the very beginning. The Make America Great Again for many African-Americans harken back to, well, what kind of America are you talking about? Back in the day, it wasn't so great for African-Americans. So this was, in many ways, would people vote for someone that they wanted to defeat? Usually people vote for someone they really love. I didn't get the sense from a lot of people in some of the data that we saw that people were necessarily in love with Joe Biden, but they felt that he was a better person in terms of bringing people together and at least respecting diversity, George.
You see the crowds growing there. Thank you, Pierre, in front of the Black Lives Matter banner there in Lafayette Square. It's a little after noon now here on the East Coast, 9 a.m. on the West Coast. And as you're just joining us now, we can now say that Joe Biden will be the 46th president of the United States. He is now president-elect of the United States. Matthew Dowd, he has a big job in front of him right now.
Oh, George, an immense job. And I was thinking of reflecting on a couple of things. As we said here, you've been in this position before, I've been in this position before, when you first learn as staff and as the incoming president that you've won, there's a sense of exhilaration and relief, but then the weight of what just happened hits you. And I also think every time a new president is elected in America, it's a pivot point in America. Every single president that's elected the first time, it's a pivot point in America. And yesterday, as you remember, I was saying that yesterday was the 160th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln getting elected. And the parallels, not that Joe Biden is Abraham Lincoln, but the parallels are immense. It was a time of immense division in our country. There was lots of change going on, incredible disruption, racial injustice, all of those things going on. And they elected a president who had immense personal loss in his life. He lost his sweetheart in his young age. He lost a child. He lost political office numerous times, Abraham Lincoln did, and he came into the presidency at a time when the country was torn apart. They didn't know which direction they were going to go, and they elected a man with a huge heart who'd been broken before.